Hi, I'm Ann Cleveland. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity at UC Berkeley, currently speaking to you from my home in Oakland.
And I'm Steve Weber. I'm the Faculty Director at the Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity, professor at UC Berkeley in the School of Information. And I am currently speaking to you from my home in Oakland, about a mile away from where Ann is.
Steve, Anne, thank you for taking the time to talk to us. We always love interacting with you at the Berkeley Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity. You are among the smartest people we know in the intersection of technology, society, and foreign policy, and your advice always carries a lot of weight with us and in our work. I would love to just start out by taking a step back and asking the two of you, with everything that's happening right now, what do you see as the main trends emerging?
Ann, you want to start?
Sure. Well, with an introduction like that, no pressure. We're honored to be among the people you consider smart colleagues, and right back at you. But, I guess, Michael, one way to start is, we often think about our cybersecurity futures practice in terms of, what is likely in the next 10 days, what is likely in the next 100 days, and what are the possibilities in the next 1,000 days. And I think at this moment in history, the next 10 or 100 days might be the hardest to have any insight into. But we've been thinking a little bit about what we might see in the next 1,000 days. And I think, one thing to pay attention to is the impact of a recession and prolonged unemployment on automation and AI and robotics. So before the pandemic, there was already a lot of anxiety about the effect of automation on jobs, and how we can retrain the workforce for a more just transition to a world where AI is going to create some jobs, but it's also going to replace a lot of others. And so in our minds, one after effect of the pandemic is that it might slow down AI deployment in industry just enough to buy us as a society time to get that transition right.
I think that's a very interesting point, that maybe the corona crisis will slow down the transformation of the labor market just enough for us to be able to keep up. On the other hand, if you look at the unemployment numbers coming out of the US and basically all countries around the world right now, it's a very dark picture that's emerging. How do you see those two trends play out, and do you think there is a reason for optimism?
Well, I don't know if I would call it optimistic, but maybe just a little bit of a silver lining, right? Because the kinds of unemployment numbers that we're seeing already are definitely not cause to be optimistic, nor the drying up of private sector investment. But again, in this frame of a just transition between automation and jobs, with labor becoming cheaper relative to capital, and probably a lot of political will in the future to preserve jobs, to create jobs, and to get humans back to work. What we as a society do with that extra time, if private sector deployment and adoption of automation and artificial intelligence tools does slow down, again, what we do with that extra time to figure out the relationship between automation and jobs is something that at least we're going to be watching very closely in the medium term.
And is it your feeling, Anne, that this discussion is something that's very much taking place in the headquarters of the major technology companies as well? The same tech companies that are driving a lot of the automation and AI tools that will impact the labor market in the years to come?
That is a really interesting question, Michael, and I would almost throw it back to you. What have you heard from your colleagues that you're talking about in those corporate strategy rooms?
Well, I do think the current situation is an opportunity for the tech sector, both to regain some of the political and public goodwill that they have lost over the last couple of years, but also to try and show that they can really contribute to the global social good in a way that I'm sure they would very much like to do. I think, however, they need to be aware of, in particular, two things. One is, effectively dealing with the amount of disinformation related to healthcare information that we see out there. That's something, obviously, a big task for the social media companies and the platforms. And secondly, also to make sure that any tools they help to roll out does not undermine privacy or sort of protection of individual rights down the line. I think even though privacy will come under pressure in the midst of a global pandemic, I think it will also be something governments and regulators will continue to keep a very close eye on. If they can manage to handle those things, I do think it's an opportunity for the tech industry to rejuvenate themselves.
Yeah, I really agree with that. And I think, it's a little bit counterintuitive. You might think in the aftermath of a pandemic, you might see a race to deploy robots, right? Because after all, robots can't get sick. But I think that reset that you're talking about may be the more overriding trend.
Thank you, Anne. Steve, I would love to bring you into the conversation as well. Would you share some of your initial thoughts on these questions?
Yeah, Michael, I'm glad to. And I want to pick up on the theme of optimism because often when one thinks of particularly times like this about those 1,000-day windows, it's remarkably easier to come up with downside scenarios and how many things can go wrong than it is to see some of the silver linings. So we've been trying really hard to look at some of those opportunity spaces. And the one that's most interesting to me is what I think of as a kind of a rebalancing of many people's thinking about risk from an over-obsession with individual risk to a little bit of a greater awareness of some irreducibly social risk. And the place where that is obviously most visible right now is in public health actions. Infectious diseases are social phenomena. And I think, we live in a society here in the United States, and even more so in this part of the world, in Northern California, where we've spent so much time over the last really 40 years kind of reorienting risk towards the individual, whether it be tax policy, pensions after the Reagan administration, and ultimately sort of the kind of a pseudo-libertarian or partially libertarian ideology of the technology industry. It's been all about empowering the individual, allowing the individual to make his or her own decisions and bearing the risks of those decisions his or herself. And I feel like when you deal with public health issues, the negative externalities, in other words, the things that I do which might kind of manage or modulate my risk in the way I like, are going to have all sorts of consequences for lots and lots of people around me. And those things are really visible right now in a way that they were not. I think the place where we're starting to already see a change in that discourse is around disease surveillance. There was a recent Pew poll, actually just came out yesterday, which showed that just over half of Americans surveyed would be willing for the federal government to collect data on where they have been and who they have been near in order to surveil for potential disease transmission and in order to enable the economy to open up again more quickly. Now, I have to ask you, if we had said to each other 2 months ago, how many Americans would allow the federal government or would be willing to let the federal government have location data about where they are? I guarantee you it would be a lot less than 50%. And even the kind of like really strong privacy advocates have kind of backed off the position that individual risk has to be the first and foremost consideration. So I feel like, look, there is going to be a kind of a backlash and a rebalance and a negotiated sort of solution in terms of how we make those trade-offs. But I feel like a rebalancing is good. The one thing that I do want to address is that there is a kind of a discussion out there now, and I think it will continue for both 100 and 1,000 days, as to whether or not any of these capabilities for social monitoring that governments take on during a crisis will ever be rolled back. And the privacy community is sort of taking this position that once the government takes on this kind of a role in a crisis, it never gives it up. And that is just historically false. The government essentially nationalized the auto industry during World War II and then gave it up. The government essentially nationalized General Motors during 2008, as we all remember, and then gave it up. The government took on extraordinary surveillance capabilities as a result of the Patriot Act after 9/11, and slowly but surely, many of those have been unraveled. So again, just to finish, I wouldn't say that people shouldn't be vigilant about those trade-offs, but I do think there's going to be a rebalancing and an awareness that, maybe we've shifted the levers a little bit too far, and there are things that we do together when we're living this closely together that we just irreducibly engage in social risk.
I think you make some very interesting points on the role of governments in the midst of this crisis, and also on the way data can be used. But what if we turn to the private tech companies? We've seen a lot of them be very active in helping to fight the COVID-19 virus and also rolling out new tools. Do you think that will significantly change the way business is being done in the future?
Well, of course, that's the irony that we've been talking about for years, Michael, which is that this data, which is incredibly useful to public health services associated with governments, has been largely denied to governments, but it's been entirely available to the tech companies and the network operators of mobile phone systems to be used almost solely for commercial purposes. So in a sense, we've allowed the commercial risk and disallowed the public health benefits. And that's why I think there's going to be a rebalancing. And maybe actually, when we sort of see that and it all becomes very transparent to people what the government actually is able to know about you, there'll be a little bit greater awareness of the fact that, hey, the commercial actors have known these things about us for a very, very long time. And they've been using it in many cases to get us to buy more things as compared to trying to prevent a pandemic outbreak. And so, there's a little bit of a rebalancing that I think is due there. And I believe that those early indicators of polling data suggest that it's going to happen.
Going back to one of your previous points, Steve, putting it a little bit sort of squarely, it seems to me that there's a difference between the US and Europe in the way that Europeans generally tend to trust governments with private data, but not companies. And
Yes.
Over here on the side of the Atlantic, it's the other way around. People do not trust governments with their data, but companies is perfectly fine. Do you think that that difference is eroding? Do you think that will change?
Yeah, I do actually, Michael. And I think that's a little bit of a cartoon perspective. And it's also not far off the truth, actually. One of those oversimplifications that actually is not that bad. It tells you a lot about the kind of modal view in both sides of the Atlantic. And so listen, we know how much tension that has caused to both sort of political relations, economic relations, competition policy, and data portability or data movement across the Atlantic. And I do think that this is going to create, this pandemic response is going to create a little bit more common ground on some issues between even the Germans and the Americans, to say nothing of the European Union as a whole. And ironically, and it would always be, kind of be a nice positive consequence of bad news, maybe we're going to discover that we're not as different as we think that we are, at least when it comes to some of these really, really crucial high social risk areas. And we'll find some ability to kind of get to a better synthesis that both sides of the Atlantic can agree on. I wouldn't give that enormously high odds, but I do think the opportunity is there.
I love the stream of optimism coming from Berkeley. One last question for you, Steve, and then one for you, Anne. Steve, on the privacy debate, you touched upon it a little bit. Do you think after the worst of this crisis is over, do you think we'll be in a better spot, or do you think we'll be in a much worse spot when it comes to privacy?
Yeah. I think we will de facto have lost some privacy. And I actually think we'll be in a better spot about it because we'll understand the benefits more clearly with regard to issues like disease surveillance and other public health issues. So it's kind of a mix, Michael. I think we will have a bit less privacy and we'll be better off for it. And we'll be more comfortable with it, which is in some ways the most important variable of all.
And you talked earlier about the way the pandemic could impact the future of work. But what if we look at the way we work and the way we interact? I mean, you're sitting in your living room, I'm sitting in my living room. Do you think working from home is here to stay?
Yeah, Michael, I think we don't know yet. I think the last 4 weeks or so, has had all of us doing a lot of things that we never expected to be doing. And I think a lot of employers have discovered that people can work from home effectively in roles where maybe that wasn't allowed before. But I think it depends a lot if you think about, an axis where on one end you have the aftermath of this pandemic and the move to having more fully virtual lives goes much faster than anybody expected. Or on the other end of the axis, you could have actually a backlash where people are absolutely sick of being on Zoom happy hours with their family and friends, and realizing some of the effectiveness that is lost when you are collaborating with your colleagues virtually. And we have a world where we actually put some clear limits on when and how we allow our lives to be virtual and when and how we allow digital tools to come in. And right now I think by necessity, we're leaning a lot towards the side of that axis that says our virtual lives are speeding up. But it's early days still. And so I think anybody who says they know what it's going to look like at the end of it, which side of that axis we'll be on, or if we're in the middle of it, probably really just doesn't know yet.
Okay, we have one last question for the both of you. As the Berkeley Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity, do you have any thoughts or reflections on how the COVID-19 might change or impact the future threat landscape, in particular in relation to cybersecurity?
I'll start with one observation about that, Michael, and I think it's a good thing, again, which is that anybody who believed still the mythology that you could protect a corporate network with a kind of castle and moat mentality by, building a moat around the network and protecting at the perimeter. Anybody who still believed that that was possible, and believe it or not, there were people who believed that was possible, now has to come to grips with the irreducible and obvious fact that the corporate network extends to the home network of every single employee who's working from home. And so your router and my laptop and my iPad are now part of your corporate network in a way that we used to pretend like maybe we could kind of control that access. And so I feel like the extreme version of what we're experiencing now will actually wipe away the mythology that was still present in many people's models of security. Not the most sophisticated firms, but some that were less sophisticated. And I think that's a good thing, because now we're going to have to grapple with the real shape of the corporate network, which is that it is everywhere all the time and every device. My little smart switch that turns off my light is now your corporate network.
Fantastic.
Yeah. And I would just add to that, of course, even before the pandemic, we saw the worlds of digital safety and physical safety merging. But I think now we're seeing that on steroids in terms of hardcore cybersecurity implications, particularly the connection between online misinformation and physical safety. And you kind of see that manifested recently with the more aggressive stance that Facebook, YouTube, et cetera, have taken on moderating coronavirus content in particular. And there's no reason to think that that trend wouldn't continue. The connection between online misinformation and climate safety actually was nascent even before the pandemic. And I think you're going to start to see kind of those constituencies merge between things like digital safety and physical/environmental safety.
And Steve, thank you very much for sharing your insights. I look forward to seeing you soon and hopefully in real life.